Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation about America's relationship with the world and the evolving nature of globalization. We're really honored to welcome our speakers and moderate, all of whom are from MIT, Suzanne Berger, Simon Johnson, and Richard Locke. My name is Evan Lieberman, and I'm also from MIT. I'm a professor of political science and the director of the Center for International Studies, which is very pleased to sponsor today's Starr Forum. The goal of our Starr Forums is to encourage productive dialogue on pressing global issues, stimulated by the insights of the world's leading authorities. So we'll hear from our moderator and the speakers first, but as always, we've set aside time for questions from all of you. And during that time, the moderator will invite you to line up behind these two microphones, and we'll ask you to ask just one question and to make it a question. And also I'll ask that you identify yourself and your affiliation if you're comfortable doing that. Also, as a reminder, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and silence your phones if you haven't already done so. Also, a quick reminder to RSVP to our next Starr Forum, which is Wednesday, December 10th at 5:30 for a discussion of America's culture war and its impact on universities, innovation, and national security. And among the speakers will be MIT President Emeritus Rafael Reif, and the moderator will be the Dean of SHAS, Agustin Rayo. So I'd like now to introduce our very esteemed moderator, and for the sake of time, this is a very short bio relative to the reality of his accomplishments. Richard Locke is the John C. Head III Dean at the MIT Sloan School of Management, a scholar of labor standards and comparative political economy. Locke began his appointment as dean in July 2025, and prior to that, he served as the dean of Apple University and was Brown University's provost, a position he held for about 8 years. Earlier at MIT, he served as the class of 1922 professor of political science and management and the Siteman Professor of Entrepreneurship, as well as being MIT Sloan's deputy dean and the head of the political science department. And on a personal note, I admit to having been disappointed that Rick was leaving MIT just as I was arriving over 12 years ago, especially as he was the one who offered me my position here and was so gracious in singing the praises of MIT and the political science department. And so today it's particularly gratifying for me to join the chorus of those expressing delight in his return. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dean Locke to the podium, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. So great to see so many of you here this evening, and it's really an honor to be able to moderate this session. Thank you for participating. And these kinds of fora are so important for the intellectual life of MIT and as a way of us learning and being together, connecting in ways that sometimes we don't often. Today we're going to be focused on one of the many very important issues of the day, which is globalization and its future, and especially in the current political moment, not just given the U.S. federal government's policies, but also just geopolitics in general, and how this might be playing out in a world where for so many of us, we just assumed we were going to be living in a world of reduced trade barriers, where you could basically make anything anywhere, sell anything anywhere, et cetera. And now with the return of tariffs, trade restrictions, and sort of not great politics between trading partners, we're at a really interesting pivotal moment. And our speakers this evening will help shed light on that. I am pleased to introduce two great colleagues, people who I have learned from and collaborated with over the years. Our first speaker is Professor Suzanne Berger, who is an institute professor at MIT. Those of you who don't know this, there's a very small group of the most prestigious professors at MIT called institute professors who are able to work across the institute. She serves on the faculty at the Department of Political Science and is affiliated with the Center for International Studies. Her research focused on a variety of things, including the politics of globalization. She also co-directs the newly launched Initiative for New Manufacturing, the INM, which brings together engineers and social scientists together to work on how to transform manufacturing, especially in high-cost, high-wage countries. She also led the MIT Production and the Innovation Economy Project, which published a variety of books, including Making in America, From Innovation to Market, which Suzanne published in 2013. She also founded the MIT International Science and Technology Initiative, MISTI program, which sends hundreds of MIT students abroad each year for internships in labs and in companies, and has become actually a model for other universities in terms of how can we actually build stronger ties between students across different universities in different countries. So it's wonderful to have Suzanne here this evening. Our second speaker is Simon Johnson, who is the Ronald A. Kurtz 1954 Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he is also the head of the Global Economics and Management Group. At MIT, he also co-directs the newly established Stone Center for Inequality and the Future of Work. And in 1924, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics. In 1924, in 2024, he received the Nobel Prize. He looks really great for his Nobel Prize in the Economic Sciences, joint with Dorona Samoglu and James Robinson for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers. And Suzanne, if you want to come up and give the first talk. Thank you.
Well, today I think we need to start from one clear fact, and that is that globalization is reversible, and globalization has, in fact, reversed. Some people, of course, still challenge this fact, and they point out that Apple is still stuck in China, that the flows of foreign direct investment have fallen true, but the levels of services that are traded is still rising, and so on and so on. But I think that if you look at the core meaning of globalization, that you may agree with me. So the core meaning, I think, let's look at an international economy. Let's imagine an international economy that is a global market. This would mean if there were one global market, that the price of all tradable goods, flows of capital, and wages would be the same everywhere in the world. Now, such an end state of the world is very unlikely. But what I think really matters here are the intense pressures towards a single world market that all producers, investors, workers, and employers feel in an international economy in which the barriers to moving goods, services, and people across the world, a world in which those barriers are low and being lowered. And the world from the 1980s to the 2010s was such an economy. It was an economy in which the barriers that had prevented goods, services, information, and people from moving across borders, those borders were being lowered. And as a political scientist, I would like to suggest that there's a very simple definition of globalization that is really the most useful for understanding our current predicament. Globalization is a state of the world in which strong competitive pressures force firms to behave as if there were a single world market. In short, it's a world in which firms seek, above all other things, to lower cost and lower price. In the past, there were natural barriers to that happening, and those barriers were distance and time. Yeah, it's true that tariffs played some role in the past, but natural barriers, distance and time, did most of the work. So if you think of the 19th century, when there were enormous flows of capital from France to Russia at the end of the 19th century, during a period that I call the first globalization, there was flows of capital because capital moves easily, but there was virtually no flow of goods from French-owned factories in Russia back into France. Few manufactured goods ever made the trip across that long distance. And that the cost was simple. The reason was simple. Transportation was really expensive. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, it's really new technologies that have erased the natural barriers to distance and time of the past. In the past, that distance, that time were the barriers that maintained national economies. But once it was possible to send a digital file from chip designers in California to a chip fab in Taiwan, there was no longer a need to co-locate the chip designer and the engineer making the mask. And for the past 30 years, firms did in fact behave as if they were competing in a single world market. The advent of digital technologies in the mid-1990s allowed them to outsource and offshore just about everything. And financial markets, Wall Street, reinforced that message by giving treating those firms that did outsource and offshore and that were pure play investments. Those were the companies that did the best. The more workers they got rid of, the more factories they closed, the better their stock prices, the more their stock prices rose. So firms that outsourced and offshored everything except their basic so-called core competence were the ones that did the best in the world of globalization in the United States. Now, once the natural barriers, time and distance, fall away, then the barriers, the only barriers that really remain, and the barriers that matter most today, are the barriers that governments put up on their borders. And that's exactly where we are today. And the barriers that government can put up are tariffs, import controls, export controls, immigration restrictions, massive immigration, deportations. And actually, we've seen some of this before, too. If any of you are from Colorado, is there anybody here from Colorado? No, nobody from Colorado. Well, in Colorado, there was massive forced deportations of Mexicans in the 1930s. In one train alone from Denver, 1,500 people were forced into a train and out back to Mexico. So this seems to be, this is far more massive, of course, today than even in the 1930s, but we're seeing things that existed in the past returning. And it's good to ask yourself whether the tariffs and border level controls that we see today, will they persist in the future if there's, let's say, a different kind of Republican elected or a Democrat elected? And here I think it's good to remember that the tariffs of Trump 1, the first administration, were not dismantled by the Biden administration. And I think it's quite unlikely that the next administration, whether or not it's Democrat or Republican, I doubt very seriously that they will be significantly reversed. So I'd like to make 2 points next. First, it's that borders tend to be invisible in peaceful times, but they do still exist. And in moments of crisis, they reemerge strongly. In 2006, I remember clearly a talk at MIT by the CEO of a very large Wall Street bank, who told us that his bank was a global bank and not an American bank. He said that the fact that their headquarters were in New York City was a historic accident, and that they were no more American than they were German or Chinese. Now, when the financial crisis emerged 2 years later, suddenly everybody rediscovered on which side of whose borders they actually belonged. And this banker rediscovered that his bank was American because it was the US government that bailed him out and bailed out the rest of the US banks as well. The British government bailed out British banks, and no one bailed out the Icelandic banks because their government simply did not have the wherewithal to do so. The second point I would make is we have a previous historic experience of globalization reversing. And I think there are lessons from that that we should be thinking about today. The first globalization ran roughly from the 1870s to August 4th, 1914. And the first globalization also was mightily helped along by changes in technology, by the cable that crossed the Atlantic and that speeded transmission of messages, by telephone, by telegraph. There were many technological changes that really accelerated. When the English banks learned about Napoleon's victory, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, they learned by carrier pigeon. As soon as you had the telegraph and telephone, you really didn't any longer learn such news that could be of economic importance by carrier pigeon. The carrier pigeon went out. So the first globalization also mightily stimulated by technological innovation. But the point about the first globalization is it reversed in one day, despite all the technologies that had enabled it. It reversed in one day, August 4th, 1914, when the British declared war on Germany in World War I. Over the years of the first globalization, capital had flowed over national borders largely without any barriers or regulation. People had moved over borders largely without passports. Now, it's true that in the United States, in the first globalization from the 1870s to August 4th, 1914, it's true that in the United States there were some immigration barriers against Japanese and Chinese, but millions of poor, quasi-illiterate European immigrants from southern Italy, from East Europe, et cetera, moved to the United States during the first globalization. So many, in fact, that the cost of labor rose significantly in the Nordic countries because the Nordic countries had massive out-migrations to the United States. If any of you grew up in the Middle West, you will probably have noticed that there are a lot of Norwegians, Finns, and Scandinavians in our Middle West. So wheat poured from the United States into European markets, and it lowered the cost of food. English workers passionately defended free trade, if you can imagine. Why? Because it meant less expensive food with wheat coming into Britain from the United States. So as you can imagine, the first globalization is a period that I'm really fascinated by and I've written about and will continue to think about. But while today we can disagree perhaps about whether globalization today has ended or is really over or not really over, there was no question about it on August 5th, 1914, because all gold stopped flowing from Britain, which was the financial capital of the world at the time, markets closed and banks closed. The government declared a debt moratorium since banks were closed. And a journalist at the time wrote that the word moratorium was so unfamiliar and strange to the English that people actually thought it referred to some variety of woolly mammoth. So the main point to remember here, I think, from the collapse of globalization on that one day in 1914 is that it took almost 70 years until the levels of cross-border flows of capital and goods and services reached the levels that they had been in July 1914. Governments did try to reverse it in the years immediately following World War I, but they did not succeed. It took until the late 1970s, early 1980s, until the level of cross-border flows reached the same levels as July 1914. And of course, some of the flows, like immigration, have never really returned to the levels of the first globalization. Now, there's a second thing to think about here too, and that's that the years between Globalization 1, ending in August 1914, and Globalization 2, starting more or less at the end of the 1970s, these were not happy years of national self-sufficiency. They were dark years that included the Great Depression and World War II. So the lesson from this is, I think, globalization is reversible and it's hard to restart. So why did our globalization fail? Well, I think the answers are pretty straightforward. Globalization was great for many people in the world. The level of world poverty fell from 42% in 1981 to 9% in 2018. But globalization was not great for many people in advanced industrial countries. In the United States, the China shock that Professor David Otter and his colleagues have analyzed, that is the shock due to the loss of jobs as import barriers from imports from China, where those barriers were reduced. That accounts for about a third of the loss of manufacturing jobs over a 10-year period. Automation probably accounts for a larger amount. But the impact of globalization was not just on workers. We need to think about the impact on a community when the one big factory in town, say a furniture factory in North Carolina, when that factory closes. It's not only that the workers in the factory lose their jobs, it's that the value of all the homes in the community goes down. It's the local lawyer, the pharmacist, the whole economy of the town goes down. So globalization was relatively bad for US workers and communities outside of Silicon Valley and Kendall Square and a few other blessed places across the continent. I think globalization failed us in a second way. It contributed to an economy that was far less resilient because far more dependent on supply chains for basic goods. And we felt that particularly during COVID. And I think we're experiencing the same sense of loss of basic security today with respect to national defense. There's a major war raging now in Europe, and a situation that is both competitive and conflictual with China in the Pacific. And so in weakening American manufacturing, globalization has played a major role in weakening our national security. Several of us here at MIT have been doing research on small and medium manufacturing firms in the United States. These are manufacturers who employ fewer than 500 workers, and they constitute 98% of all manufacturing companies in the US. Now, while we all are worrying about what AI will do to our economy, it is a fact that only 12% of the factories of these manufacturers even have one robot. And I assure you, from visiting their factory floors, that's exactly what they will have, likely just one. Their factory floors are filled with machines their grandfathers bought in the 1940s. And these companies are the defense suppliers working as subcontractors to the big defense firms. So globalization has had a massive and negative effect on US national security by weakening manufacturing. So to conclude, what should Rethinking Globalization, the title of our meeting today, mean today? First and foremost, I think it should mean getting our own domestic economy right. And I believe that that's going to be what Simon's going to be talking about. Even though new digital technologies made it possible to offshore and outsource practically everything, it wasn't technology that imposed offshoring. It was US financial markets that imposed offshoring. So how do we know, actually, that it wasn't the inevitable outcome of technological change? Well, we can compare the US situation with another advanced industrial economy, Germany, for example. Still today, 20% of the German workforce is still employed in manufacturing, in contrast to the United States, where it's 9%. Have manufacturing numbers gone down in Germany too? Yes, they went down from 24% of the workforce 10 years ago to 20% now. But still, it's a very different outcome than the 9% in the US today. And they have the very same technologies that we have. So my point is, same technologies, same globalization, but very different outcomes because of different national policies. So I think the first and most important task in rethinking globalization is to get our own national house and economy in order. And as for rebuilding the web of international agreements that once underpinned globalization, today, with the administration we currently have, I see that as a very, very distant prospect, impossible in the near future. Perhaps the most we could do today is to restore some measure of trust in US commitments and alliances with at least those countries that over the past 70 years have been our nearest allies: Canada, the European Union, Japan. And it seems to me that an international order that's held together by force alone is inevitably going to be a very weak international order. Those who obey American rules today, because they've been bullied, those who agree to obey particular standards today because they have to, they have every incentive to ally against us in the short or medium term. And so I see this as a world that's become a very dangerous world, and one that we need to do everything possible to get out of. Thank you.
That was great. That was great.
Thanks very much for being here, for the invitation to speak, and for the kind words of introduction from Dean Richard Locke. And thank you, Suzanne, for those brilliant and insightful comments. And thank you also for the many decades of work that you've devoted and your leadership in this field. But I think we need to have a discussion. So I'm going to try and be a little provocative and stir things up a little bit, Suzanne. But next time we have coffee, we'll make it up. Don't worry. And I should also like to say, and this is really quite an important disclosure. And I don't think Richard mentioned this in his otherwise generous introduction, that while I have been on the faculty at MIT for close to 30 years, I have been away doing various things and at different points in time. In 2007, 2008, I was the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. And nothing that has gone wrong with the global economy is my fault. Let's just be clear about that. So I'm going to speak about 3 dates, 1944, 1989, and 2024-25, the modern moment. And try to weave things together. My story is entirely consistent in my own mind with Suzanne's story, but there's some differences in nuance and maybe some slight differences in implications. And I think I might, in the end, be a bit more, I think I am quite a bit more optimistic than Suzanne. It could be because I'm an immigrant, Suzanne. So if I'm wrong about America, I've just wasted a lot of time I could have spent elsewhere in the world. But I think we can come back from where we are now. So 1944, the US has realized quite suddenly that it's become the technological, military, and potentially economic superpower. Remind you that up until early December 1941, the overwhelming consensus among the American public and members of Congress was they did not want to get involved in another European war. They had been involved at the end of the First World War. It had not been a great experience. They had not, the Senate had not ratified the Treaty of Versailles. The US had stepped back from international commitments. And President Roosevelt, who was inclined to try and help the British in various ways, thought he had to tread very carefully until the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then, in classic American style, they go from being enormously, massively lukewarm to being incredible enthusiasts and switching industrial production massively over to the war effort. And almost immediately, this is actually true, late December 1941, the White House was told to expect a secret visitor whose name could not be disclosed, but they needed a lot of champagne and whiskey to be available because Winston Churchill, it turned out, was coming to town. And almost immediately, the Americans started to plan on what the post-war world economy would look like. Now, this is just an extraordinary moment of, hubris, right? You've had an enormous depression. The 1930s were very bad. The 1920s were okay in moments, but as Suzanne said, the 1940, 1980 was incredibly traumatic and massively destroyed the world trading system. And then you had this another war. So if you think about the heyday of globalization, I would say in the first decade of the 20th century, and it seemed like the world was full of promise, including technological promise, the promise of invention, the promise of better lives, longer lives, higher productivity, and actually rising real wages. After that was 50 years of chaos and catastrophe and a massive amount of deaths. And the Americans said, you know what, we think we could do better. And in 1944, they convened a conference at Bretton Woods, which is in New Hampshire. It's a lovely resort. It's been restored. You can take a bath in the same bathtub that John Maynard Keynes used. Okay, that might be more of an economics thing. I understand. You may not want. Anyway, so the Americans brought all their friends and allies together, including the Soviet Union, by the way. And the question was, what should the world look like? What should be the organizing principle of the post-war economy? And Winston Churchill had already made this point in 1941, and of course, his delegates were there in 1944, and they raised their hand and said, yes, we've got a good idea. Let's go back to the British Empire and the way that trade was organized on an imperial basis and the financial flows that were associated with that. And the Americans said, you know what, guys, that didn't work very well. See the last 50 years. And also, we're in charge now, so no. And they created at Bretton Woods and subsequently 3 institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and what was originally known as the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, subsequently, or now you know it as the World Trade Organization. And the basic principle behind this American design system was that there would be rules. The rules would apply to everyone. Look, the world is not a very fair place, right? Is there some unevenness in the application of rules? Sure, absolutely. But here's a key point, which is the International Monetary Fund, which was designed to lend to countries that were would be in trouble, that needed help with their balance of payments, that needed short-term conditional loans. The IMF has always had, and still does have, a European as its managing director, and the Europeans are, they have the most seats on the board and they have the largest combined shareholding, bigger than the United States. Now, the United States has a veto, don't get me wrong. The IMF is located a convenient 3 blocks from the White House, and the only substantial organization between the IMF and the White House is the World Bank. So these were instruments of American power and influence. And you know, I didn't choose the title of this session. I like the title. But I think there's a slight presumption or implication, given some other discussions in this country at this time, that somehow it wasn't always America first. No, this system, this Bretton Woods system, was in no ways designed as a system of altruism. I mean, what brought the Americans out of their cocoon in 1941 was an attack by long-range bombers launched from aircraft carriers in the Pacific. What changed the mindset of American technologists, including leading professors and administrators at MIT, was an understanding that the technology of flight had changed profoundly. In 1918, the fastest bomber in the world was probably the Handley Page bomber. It could fly 98 miles an hour, had a range of perhaps 150 miles. By 1940, the fastest, well, the Spitfire, and the Spitfire, which was the decisive defensive weapon in the Battle of Britain, could dive at 500 miles an hour, which was almost, and the Messerschmitt 109, which was the top German fighter plane, was almost as fast. And long-range bombers were already fitted to fly hundreds of miles, and they were very close to being able to cross the Atlantic. So the idea there was one, that the US was isolated somehow from threats. That idea, at MIT, Vannevar Bush, who was the former dean of engineering, was a leading defense intellectual, I think we'd now call him, and a leading light in the wartime effort. He and his friends realized that that world had gone because of human invention. So what world can you build in which America will be protected, America will be prosperous, and we'll stop having world wars, and we won't have another Great Depression? So we create an IMF. The IMF will be funded by initially US capital. The US did have most of the gold available in the world at that moment. But we will empower the presumed, so the US is the creditor to the world at that moment, and likely going forward. But we will empower, the Americans said, the presumed debtors, the Europeans in that instance, so they don't feel like they are being mistreated. So it's America first, attempting to build a world around America, and by the way, inviting the Soviet Union into that world. The Soviet Union was at Bretton Woods, but declined to show up at the IMF. So they went their own way and they created their own trading system and their own financial system and their own economic system. So how did this system do? This America first system that was built with all this hubris, or you could even say, I think, straight out arrogance. I don't think anybody today would have the opportunity, but certainly even imagine they could design such a system. Well, we can talk about it, and that's why we're here, to have a discussion, and history continues, so no doubt we will never finish having a discussion. But I think it was by far the most successful global system ever designed. I mean, Europe was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, most of the rest of the world was extremely poor. The goal was to get Europe back on its feet, to help Europe build a system for itself that would prevent or deter further war. One of my friends and colleagues likes to say that if you look back from a great distance at world history, and as future historians will presumably do, the thing that really distinguishes the second half of the 20th century will probably be that Europe, Western Europe, no longer fights itself. European wars dominated world history for centuries, at least since 1500, at least since the Europeans expanded out of Europe. And they stopped fighting. They stopped fighting in order to trade, in order to cooperate on the development of technology, in order to participate in this Bretton Woods-anchored, American-led system. A system that they complained about from time to time, but they benefited from greatly. And when the fixed exchange rates, which were the foundation of this system, broke apart in 1973, and there were lots of other macroeconomic, associated macroeconomic problems, including inflation and so on, when the dust settled from that, people were holding more dollars around the world than they'd been holding before. So the Bretton Woods system survived the end of fixed exchange rates. It survived actually the transition of the US from being a big net creditor to the world to being a big net debtor, because we borrow from the world, people invest in the United States. You can have some qualms about that, and that may be a topic that we discuss, but that's what's happened, and that is what has continued. And people, the Europeans and others who participate in the system have, I would say, benefited greatly from it. Now, there are obviously complaints. There's many people who didn't like the system. And when I emphasize that it was US thinking about Europe, and also a little bit Japan, some other countries have managed to find a seat at that table, including the oil exporting countries, on account of their money that they made in the 1970s. But many other countries, including in what they would now call themselves the Global South, have felt that they've always been outsiders to the system. And I think there's some validity to that. If you look at the representation of African countries, or if you look at the debates over the representation of China, it takes you a long time and a lot of economic achievement to get anything close to parity of voice. That's the case of China at the IMF, and the African countries are still far behind. So yes, it is a 1944 system that has been successful, and that success has changed the world in ways that create legitimate grievances. But that leads me to my second date, which is 1989. I had the great fortune and remarkable luck to visit Poland and meet with leading officials in the first Solidarity government in the summer of 1989. And I subsequently went to work for that government in a very minor role, beginning of my career, just after I got my PhD from MIT. And I participated in policy and in studying what was happening in that what was then called, still largely called, the post-communist world. And the important thing to remember, I think, is that while you certainly can have grievances, and it's absolutely fine, and I encourage everyone who in this room and in other rooms who doesn't like how the IMF operates or the World Bank operates or how the World Trade Organization operates, I encourage you to speak out and to call out the injustices, and we need to do better. But nobody forces any country in the world today to adopt a particular economic system. These are choices that you make. You can choose a strategy. Do you want to have import substitution? Do you want to have exports? Do you want to focus on exporting commodities? Do you want to add value to those commodities? Now, those are decisions that you can make. And in 1989, I can tell you, because I was there, what the Polish people wanted to do was get out from the Soviet bloc. And they were looking for viable alternatives. And you can have absolutely fascinating academic discussions about how you want to structure the economy and economic justice and so on and so forth. But you come right down to it. You're an economic policymaker. The Russian army is still in your country. I think certainly they let Solidarity contest the election in June 1989 and then let it take power because they thought they were going to fail because the economic situation was so dire. You have to make choices as policymakers that are realistic choices that are going to deliver on benefits for your people. And yes, escaping the Soviet Union was a long-term goal of Poland, and people were willing to put up with some cost, but they also wanted delivery on the results. So what did the post-communist countries choose to do in 1989? They chose to come into this global system, into the America First system, and they were welcome into that on the same basis as other countries, on the rules-based approach. Did things go wrong subsequently? Sure. Have there been financial crises? Absolutely. Capitalism and financial crises are essentially synonymous, so you should get used to that one. But this system has lasted and survived massive shocks over decades. And I think it's quite fair to say that none of its founders, who are obviously not with us anymore, none of its founders could have imagined the legs on this system. Which brings us to today, 2024, the second election of Donald Trump as president. But much more broadly, I think the retreat from the notion of globalization that Suzanne correctly identified. We had a fantastic talk at MIT today from Susan Stokes, who's a professor at Chicago, and has a great book called The Backsliders, talking about the retreat from democracy around the world in various places. And she links that very closely to changing attitudes towards globalization, but she particularly points the finger at rising inequality. And I think this is really the heart of the problem, which is, while I am not saying that the system is, as it has previously existed, was entirely just, and I'm not saying that it was great for everybody. And there are many countries around the world that have reason to complain. And people in the United States have had complaints also. Some complaints over a long period of time. What's really changed in the past 2 decades is that many people in the United States have felt that the global system was not operating in their interest. Now, there's a couple of phenomena going on here, and Suzanne mentioned them, and I think she also correctly attributed the relative importance. So let me restate that. So over a long period of time, 40 years, we've had a great deal of automation in the United States, digital automation, actually, not so much in all the manufacturing firms Suzanne was talking about. And that has led to a loss of jobs for many people who were in the middle class. So loss of jobs, and if you lose a job, well, one of my friends who's a leading labor economist likes to say that the labor market policy of the United States is quite simple. It is get another job. So you lose your job in the middle class, you were working in manufacturing, or you're working in a white-collar job, that's been automated away. You get pushed down to the lower end of the American labor market. Real wages for people like you and me, people with a lot of education, have risen steadily as the technological transformation continued in recent decades. Real wages for people in the middle have not been so impressive, and many people got pushed down from the middle. Real wages for men who didn't finish high school have barely moved since the 1970s. So everybody who feels like they got left behind, statistically, in those categories of people, they did get left behind by automation, but globalization absolutely reinforced that. And actually, to be completely honest, I think disentangling the technology piece and the globalization piece is a little tricky because, again, as Suzanne said, many of the changes in communication technology and also transportation technology are part of what facilitated globalization. So it's technological change, which we see in automation and in globalization, is what I would say. That's part and parcel. Some people have done well in the United States. Some people feel like they've been left behind. And I think that's the root of our problem now. And that is why we have policies that have been more than proposed, have actually been implemented, attempting to redress that. And the really unfortunate point of today's situation, and I wish this were not the case, and it really pains me to have to say this to you and say to other people, is that while some of the intentions from the administration are pointing in the right direction in terms of worrying about manufacturing, worrying about good jobs, worrying about some parts of the United States, the policies that they put in place are almost entirely counterproductive, and some of them are going to be massively destructive for our medium-term prospects. Now, I had the great privilege to co-edit a book on the economic consequences of the second Trump administration with Beatrice Veda de Mauro, who happens to be sitting in the front row, coincidentally. And you can read it for yourself. I think we have about 40 chapters, 57 contributors, people from across the political aisle. There's an essay by Michael Strain in there from the American Enterprise Institute that I particularly recommend to anybody who's interested in manufacturing. So study the details for yourself. Look at the policies. Look at what's been promised. Look at what's been implemented. But tariffs, as currently constructed, I don't think are going to bring back manufacturing jobs in the way they're intended. Attacking science and universities is going to be absolutely disastrous for growth because these are a major growth engine. And the policies, the particular ways that immigrants are being treated and the implications of that are absolutely awful and inappropriate. I do believe we should control the borders, and I think we will. But I think what's being done on immigration, purely from an economic point of view, purely from a demographic point of view, purely from a point of view of where's the dynamism in this economy, it's catastrophic. You know, I've been to New York Harbor, out to the Statue of Liberty, to check the inscription for myself. And it definitely does not say, send me only PhDs in computer science. Right? It sends me, send me your huddled masses yearning to be free. And basically, what powered the United States to become the greatest industrial center the world has ever known was unskilled labor that was brought into factories and upskilled. They upskilled themselves. So did their employees. There was a massive demand for labor. That's what drove it. That's what you need to get back to. You need to create jobs. You need to create jobs for everyone. You need to push science engineering, technology in every single part of this country. John Gruber and I wrote a book about this called Jumpstarting America. It came out in 2019. I remember having a meeting on Capitol Hill in early 2020 with somebody who said, "We love the book, Simon, really, really good book. You've identified 100 places around the country that could really take off and generate a whole generation of new jobs, but we're not going to do it. We've got too many other things on our mind." That was the last meeting that I had, and I think the last meeting that my friend had before COVID. Now, I understand you may not like vaccinations. We can talk about that. I understand you may feel conflicted about some of the things. I've had all the vaccines, by the way. I'm a fan. But I think that what was understood in that moment, and this, some of our ideas, I'm very happy to say, got picked up in the 2020 Chips and Science Act, as did a lot of ideas from MIT, including fantastic work by President Reif at the time and many other faculty members. Those ideas, that agenda, did get bipartisan support. And I see Liz Reynolds in the audience, who worked very long and hard, including at the White House, to promote that agenda. Thank you very much, Liz, for that work. And that was moving in the right direction. That was moving in the right direction. That would have rebuilt manufacturing and jobs and innovation. And that the key idea that I take from all your work, Suzanne and Liz, is that you innovate much better when you also manufacture, when the manufacturing is close enough, geographically, intellectually, emotionally, culturally. Manufacturing and innovation belong together, not on opposite sides of the world. Now, that's not an anti-world message. That's not America alone. That's America innovating, creating good jobs, leading the world economy, and creating opportunities for the world. That's the America that I believe in. That's the America that we have had. That's the America that Suzanne and Liz and many others worked to build and rebuild. That's not the America, unfortunately, that's unfolding before our eyes right now. So we can do better. We will do better. I do think universities can and should lead. I think we can create more good jobs in a world that, yes, is going to be America first in terms of AI or new technology creation. And that can be a good thing if we focus on being constructive and being positive for ourselves and for everybody we work with around the world. Thank you very much.
Suzanne, why don't we? Nice job. So thank you both for two really fantastic presentations, somewhat different in terms of optimism and very pessimistic view of the current moment. What I thought we could do is maybe I would just kick off with a question for each of you, and then we'll open up for general discussion and questions from the audience. Suzanne, I too was thinking about the legacy of your work, and I think especially in the production and the innovation economy, one of the big findings of your work was the importance of the ecosystem. And that the co-location of manufacturing with R&D, with community colleges, et cetera, it was that ecosystem. I think, not being able to go it alone or stay home alone, I can't remember what the metaphor was very, very important. And so when I think about the differences between, say, the current moment and even what happened at the end of the first globalization, and I love the historical analogy. I thought that was really, really terrific. It seems to me that notwithstanding the America First rhetoric of the current government, that even they recognize that we can't go it alone. That you said that what is the thing that we need to do? We need to rebuild the economy. But can we actually rebuild the U.S. economy without the flow of talent that comes into the United States to go to universities like this one and then populate our firms? Even the current administration will say, no visas from people from this country and then backslide. No OPTs or H-1B visas for the people from certain countries, but then they'll backslide because they realize, I think I even heard a clip either today or yesterday morning of the president saying, we need people with certain skills to do it. So it seems to me that while it looks very gloomy, there's a real recognition that we need, whether it's certain inputs, rare minerals, or certain other, skilled labor that we have to. And so while things look so dire today, maybe there's a pragmatism, even in the current America First moment, recognizing that for the US to succeed, even in a diminished globalized world, we have to be somewhat open. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I mean, I think that in the most, in the international order that I would see as the most desirable one, we would have flow of people across borders. But as Simon said, I think borders actually need to be regulated, that what we're really looking for is an economy, an international economy and a domestic economy based on rule of law. And rule of law starts at the border and regulates the flow of people in and out. And rule of law should be, it seems to me, what a liberal society above all tries to regulate. You don't pick people up, you don't have masked agents snatching people off streets and bundling them off in the night. You try to regulate at the border in a specified, predetermined, legal way who comes in and how people exit. And I certainly agree that we need, and I mean, look at the MIT community. Look at what what people born outside of the United States contribute to the MIT community. Something, I think, like 45% of professors at MIT were born outside the United States. This is one of the greatest strengths of the MIT community. And it's one of the greatest strengths of the United States. We know that people born outside the United States are excessively likely to do startups in the United States. So in seeking to rebuild or transform manufacturing in the United States, I think the objective that I have in mind is not to create lots more jobs, but to create good jobs, not to make everything in the United States, but try to focus on those activities that are close to innovation and that can nourish innovation. And when I think about the ecosystem, I think of an example like Kodak in Rochester. When Kodak was a strong company, Kodak supported classes on optics in the Rochester Community College. Kodak had apprenticeships for workers, and many of the workers that had been trained in Kodak factories then basically leaked out into the general economy and worked at the factories of Kodak suppliers and other optics firms in the Kodak, around Kodak. So when Kodak went down, that was the end of optics classes in the community college. That was the end of this flow of trained workers from Kodak into the other optics firms. And so it's like a giant hole in the ecosystem of optics, of the optics industry around that had surrounded Kodak. And that's where, I mean, I always think about these holes as somehow home alone, meaning that firms that got left there, basically the American manufacturing firms that still survived, basically they had to have all of the capabilities that they needed within their own four walls, instead of having access to public goods like worker training, like information on new technology. Those public goods had previously been provided by the very firms that disappeared, outsourced, offshored, et cetera. So that's, I guess, the way I would see this.
Yeah, just to reinforce this point, I mean, one of the things that makes MIT such a great university is that we're a global university, our student body, our faculty, et cetera. And one of the things that we're seeing at MIT, but also at other major US universities, is a decline of applications from international students, dramatic decline. like 25%, even more in certain fields. Not so much because of the direct policies, because probably the people who we want would be able to get visas, et cetera, but because of the ambiance. Why come here if you're not going to if you're afraid of being,
Not welcome.
not welcome and a variety of other things. And so we're seeing that, which is such a short-sighted, as Simon had said, such a short-sighted policy. I guess what I was trying to push is, can we even go it alone if we're going to try to rebuild from home and then try to launch a new wave of globalization? And I'm not clear that we can, given the skill base. And Simon, it's wonderful that we have two people who use this history as the analog to try to explain what's going on and how we got here. And I loved your reframing of the Bretton Woods system as an American first system that worked well for us, but seemed to work well for many others as well. And you were very good about talking about what the limitations were for some. But it seemed to me that when you had said something like, well, during that period it was relatively peaceful, it was peaceful for the Europeans. They weren't directly fighting with one another, but it was not very peaceful for their colonial powers and the role that they played there. And then later on, as the former Soviet Union states came in, it wasn't very long before it wasn't very peaceful among them, as we're seeing today. So I just wonder, as we reimagine what a new, even if it's American-led, I don't know if it can be, a new Bretton Woods-like system could be going forward. How do we construct that so it would be fair for everyone, peaceful for everyone, prosperous for everyone, instead of the ins and outs that you have shown in your work that you're concerned about for your work? And again, likewise, the work that you did with Jonathan was Gruber, which I think is a fantastic book. But can we actually rebuild science on our own if we're going to shut down these borders?
Well, we can definitely rebuild or ramp up science spending and commercialization and the link between innovation and manufacturing. I think that's a very doable agenda. We can do a lot of it ourselves, for ourselves. We could do even better if we cooperate globally. I think we've learned that in the past too. So that part doesn't trouble me, Richard. I think you're absolutely right that and I did try to say that the Bretton Woods system was really focused on Europe and rebuilding Europe, and also making sure Japan was rebuilt. And so other countries were not as central, and the European empires still existed. They were more than vestigial at that point. They were substantial. And the fading of those empires is important, and it's a good thing these countries could become independent, but they got very difficult legacies as a result. So, I think it's hard to give a big abstract question. We'd have to talk about exactly what are we talking about, including climate change, including, it is obviously not fair to say to countries, oh, we the Europeans and European offshoots put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere during our industrialization. You must now not do that. Well, that's obviously a problem. So what is their path forward, and how are you going to finance that, and what's reasonable? This is obviously what they're grappling with in Brazil right now, and they've been grappling with this for some years around the COP system. So there's many specific pieces that I think we'd have to break down and look at that. But on the post-communist transition, I think this is a particular problem of the violence is a problem of Russia and Russian leadership and the Russian role in the world. And I think that's some major misses there by the Europeans and the Americans that were, I would say, separate from the global trading system.
Yeah, great. Why don't we open it up for questions and comments from the audience? There are 2 microphones on the end, so if you could please come down, identify yourself, and then ask a question. And as Evan said, please make sure it is a question. That would be great. Barry.
It's nice to see all of you here on the panel today. I guess I want to ask
Barry,
you,
we know you, but maybe
I'm
not
Barry
everyone.
Posen. I teach international politics in the political science department. I've been colleagues of these people for a long time. I wonder if I could just push a little bit to say a bit more about the overlay of geopolitics and globalization, right? The bipolar competition, that Simon talked about, it took place with the Soviet Union, and as you pointed out, they had their economic system, we have ours. The economic system that grew up after the Cold War ended, helped give rise to China's growth. And now we have a kind of a bipolar competition inside a similar economic system, much like the first globalization, Suzanne. So I guess I just be interested in your thoughts about in what ways the rise of China has been part of the flight from globalization in the United States. It seems to me, one causal mechanism is the one you said, which was, by way of trade. But China looms much larger in our debates in other ways. So I'd just be interested in hearing you talk about the overlay of geopolitics and geoeconomics, as some people now call it. Thank you.
Great. So then, do you want to start?
So I think that the entry of China into the World Trade Organization both had a disastrous effect on the American workforce, at least in some areas of the United States. And that was the areas where there was direct import competition. And that was heavily those were largely areas in the Middle West, not the coast. So in one sense, that that was a significant China factor. But I think the other way in which China really significantly changed the system was China did not play by the rules of the WTO. And so from the beginning of its entry, from really 2001, the system was really crumbling. And the United States sort of pretended, I would say, not to notice that China was not playing by the rules. And when I talk about the rules of the WTO had to do with protection of intellectual property, the fact that companies that actually moved into China were forced to teach the Chinese about their technology in order to actually be allowed to operate in China at all. Many institutions, like banking institutions, were not allowed to move into China at all. So the Chinese really played by and continued to play by entirely different rules of the WTO. And why did the United States basically pretend not to notice this? Well, I would say because the American business, American big business, American Wall Street, at that point had great hopes of actually new markets in China. And the American business community really has only turned against China and has only started squawking about the violation of the rules once it became clear that the Chinese were not going to allow, let's say, the American big companies to move into higher value segments of the Chinese economy. Okay, fine for making socks and sneakers and Nike and New Balance and all the rest in China, but if you actually want to be making silicon chips, if you want to be doing things that are much higher value, the Chinese government absolutely refused. So we've had a radical shift in the United States about collaboration with China. And it was exactly at the moment of this U-turn by the US business community, to return to Barry Posen's question, that suddenly we discovered what perhaps might have been obvious from the start, that Chinese military capabilities had and were increasing significantly, and were a challenge, were emerging as a challenge and a competitor to those of the United States. So I think that the American business community was really was really the dominant player in this, in both how long it took us to recognize the military implications of Chinese rise, and in how long it took us to recognize that the Chinese were not playing by the rules of the WTO.
Simon?
I think it was Tacitus who pointed out that the quote-unquote barbarians who invaded and took over the Roman Empire were mostly armed with weapons that the Romans had produced and sold to them. So, yes, you do need to think about the bigger picture, which I think is what Suzanne's saying. Did China break the rules, or did China play the game the way that great powers play the game? I mean, the US doesn't exactly always adhere to WTO rules. The US did allow China in and encouraged China to export. I think American business was primarily the driver and responsible, as you do, Suzanne. I would not say Wall Street. I think that lets mainstream business off the hook too easily. I think there were too many owners and managers of businesses across America who said, "Oh, let's take advantage of the cheaper labor costs." And let's...
And it was only at the point, it was big American business that pushed for Chinese admission to WTO. And it was only when American big business and interest discovered that they were not going to be able to use the growth of China. They were not going to be allowed to build businesses in China that were higher value businesses. So yes for sneakers, but no for high technology and for more valuable products.
There's a fascinating book that coming out next year from Owen Zidar and others, showing that there's many rich people across the United States, including business owners, including in communities that don't have a lot of good jobs left. So I think this attribution, obviously, playing some sort of blame game is not super constructive, but I think there was a general attitude in the US, to your point about communities and ecosystems, Suzanne, that we don't actually need all these people around us to be so prosperous. We can make money as a business, moving a lot of the need for labor elsewhere. And that, I think, was just a colossal social mistake. And by the way, for if there are any followers of Milton Friedman in the audience, you do still meet a few. Friedman said the business of business is business. Okay, but Suzanne just told you that business can change the rules. Business can let the competition in. Business can pursue the cheaper labor. So how does that figure? And George Stigler, from the same generation of Chicago economists, pointed out that anytime you regulate, the regulations get captured by the business. So I think we have to look at ourselves, those of us who teach managers, actually, and work with managers and executives around the United States. What's the vision that we have, that our students have, for what they're building and for whom? And this is not an anti-China message. I think China has achieved fantastic things, and on the technological front, they are a very serious challenger. And the way to respond to that is by doing better ourselves. But the availability of cheap renewable energy, including solar and wind around the world, is primarily because China's had a lot of technological breakthroughs, which they should be praised. So China is an invitation and I would suggest a requirement, what puts the pressure on us to innovate further and harder and drive more of that through universities, which is what we're good at. To shut down universities or to curtail that science invention process is just to limit our own possibilities. It's self-defeating.
I mean, I would say, Simon, that actually the big innovations, technological innovations in solar, for example, were American. And what it was that China really contributed here, which was enormously important, was they figured out how to make this cheaper.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. We have over here a question. Yes. Please identify yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Well, thank you very much for your insights. I'm Carla, an MBA student. My question for you is, how do you think globalization has shaped the role that high reputation schools like MIT play in creating global elites? And on the other hand, how do you think, or what do you think schools like MIT can do to actually make education accessible to everyone, not like American first, but like everyone in the world?
Okay, great.
I think that's a question for you.
So there seem to be two questions. What can we do to make sure that we are training people so we don't make the mistakes of the past? I think was the first one. And then secondly, how do we make sure that we are sharing what we do here to a broader audience? Great questions. I think the first thing that's really, really important is we have to make sure that we are accessible to the best talent all over the world, regardless of what country they come from, what perspectives they have, what socioeconomic class they are. That's what MIT is great at. And that's essential for our success. I think that's true for Sloan. I think it's true for all the other parts of MIT. And as we are training future leaders, I mean, the Sloan mission, hopefully you know this, is to develop principled, innovative leaders who are going to improve the world. I take that very, very seriously. And that means not only giving people the skills they need to succeed in the current economy, but making sure that they are guided by core values that anchor them as they're doing that work. And so while they're trying to think about how can they do best by their employers or the firms that they may own or have started, how can they do that in a way that actually thinks about a broader set of stakeholders? So not the Milton Friedman world, but a broader set of stakeholders that everyone can benefit, because it is the village, it takes a village to succeed, that we've learned the hard way is important. So that's what I think is we should be training, giving people the very, very best training at MIT, making sure that the managerial side is linked very much with the technical side. That's our comparative advantage. But making sure that everyone that we train is also has embodied these core values about what it means to be in capitalism, a capitalist market in the 21st century. And it's not a rigid one. Did you want to amend that?
I just want to reinforce and agree with you, Dean Locke. So I
We have known each other forever, so just so you know.
I first set foot on this campus to get my PhD in 1985. I was 10 years old. And since that time, the population of the United States has increased by 100 million. The number of places for undergraduate study at elite American universities has increased by about 20 people, maybe 35. I mean, it's small. The problem I think, Carl, we have, and this is part of what we're seeing politically now, is that you're asking a much larger population to fit through the same aperture to be considered elite. And that's a problem, and that generates an enormous amount of resentment. I think that and this is not an original thought to me, I agree with the people who argue that the really big positive transformative impact of artificial intelligence could be to break down all our traditional barriers and to allow a lot more people around the world, including people with quite limited connectivity or not much regular access to grid electricity, allow them to access ideas, technological ideas, engineering ideas, management ideas, whatever it is that will help lift them up. But I do still think that even and I really hope and encourage students and faculty to pursue this kind of opportunity, because, you know, if you don't, who will? I do still think that we have to change our views of elite. I think we have to expand that aperture, Carla. I think more places have to reach that level, and that's part of why I advocate for increased science spending and spreading that around the country. This used to be a country with many geographically diverse places for innovation. And we've become a country where innovation is concentrated primarily on the east and west coast. That's not healthy. It's not necessary. It doesn't make sense given where a lot of talented people live. And we can push very hard in another direction.
But just to build on this, among the highly selective universities, I wouldn't call them elite, MIT really stands out. We don't have legacy admissions. We don't give honorary degrees. You know, you're here. Most of our undergraduates are on financial aid, and a significant number of them are the first people in their families to go to college. It's a very different demographic than where I had worked previously in the other quote-unquote elite universities. I think to answer your second question about how can we share more, these are the efforts like open learning that MIT puts its material out and shares it for free to our communities. And now one of the new presidential initiatives is the new educational initiative, which is trying to invent MIT quality education using technology at a very, very different price point to get that out to many, many more students, given that there are limits to how, by the way, Cambridge, Massachusetts puts a limit on how many students we can have residentially on campus. It's not just an MIT policy. So that's the way we can do it. These are initial efforts, but I think that's the way that we can share while also maintaining the greatness of this great university. Let's turn it over to Bish and then we'll go.
Thank you, Rick. Bish Sanyal from Urban Studies Planning. I have a question to Johnson about bringing the China conversation back, which Barry was trying. I think it's very important for our times. And compared to the Cold War, which Russia and which Susan identified very well after Second World War. So China, it strikes me that, first of all, when we let China join WTO, etc., our hope was that through trade, the political system in China will change. That was the intention, because we had seen Soviet Union collapse, and then we thought trade, free trade, market institutions, etc., will eventually change China, which didn't. And I just wanted to know, what's your speculation, why it didn't change? And let me add one more thing about this, about the China, eminence of China and India, Brazil, etc., the new group that's emerging. Now, they are proposing new institutions at the global level, which may not be directly challenging IMF, but it is there to propose that we need institutions that we will control. Okay, so I want Johnson to say a little bit about how you see that unfolding. And when we get into that fight with these developing countries, so-called Global South, it seems to me that China is there hovering at the back. They are expanding their operation all around the world, investment, while we are withdrawing. And so to what extent this withdrawal at a time when China is expanding is going to make us good, make us successful?
Yeah, great. Given the time, I'm going to actually collect a few questions and then turn it over to our panelists. Ken.
Sure. My name is Ken Oy. I'm a professor emeritus political science. I also just got off the plane yesterday from speaking in Madrid and Geneva on many of these points. The question I'm posing actually emerges from that trip. Boy, there are a lot of questions on Trump, of course. But the question that we need to be thinking about here is the system that you've described has not fallen apart despite the extraordinary provocations of the administration. So the question is really on the dog that hasn't barked as loudly as one might expect. If you look at international reactions, either through rule of law and dispute settlement mechanisms, or through bilateral retaliation, in my view, there's been less than one might have expected, and the system has not collapsed because of that. The question, why has the dog, the other dogs out there, not barked more loudly in reaction to the provocations coming from our administration?
All right, thank you. Why don't we turn to our panelists?
Well, as you talk of the barking dog, I would think back also to the question that Barry Posen started with, and what is it that I actually see as the most dangerous aspect of the current situation, and it's that we have totally destroyed the trust of our own allies in their trust and confidence in us. And so we have, as we look at countries like Japan, Korea, Germany, these are countries that are wealthy and have an abundance of scientific knowledge. Well, if you ask why have these countries not developed nuclear weapons, the answer is that they basically trusted in the United States that we would defend them. And if I were one of the leaders of Japan, Korea, and Germany, I would no longer have that confidence today. So I see a dangerous world emerging now where every country basically believes that it has to contain within its own borders the means of wreaking utter damage on other societies. And the mere fact that no one can any longer really trust an American commitment, let alone our nearest neighbor, Canada. And so this opens up a world of dangers that I think we really have never actually experienced in this country.
Great, thanks. Simon.
Yes, to Ken's question, I think countries have figured out how to play the game. It's a new game, and it's a different game. You can play golf. You can get your hands on critical minerals. There's lots of ways to counterbalance. And the system is valuable, and the system is hard to replace. And to the point that Bish made about, or the question about India or others wanting to build an alternative system, go for it. I mean, nobody's stopping you. It's a free world at that level. There's been many discussions of it for a long time. Problem is, a lot of sets of countries that might organize themselves, including, for example, the BRICS, often talked about in this context, they don't get on that well. And they're not well enough to organize a monetary fund or cooperative lending in the same sort of under duress framework. They don't particularly want to share the renminbi as their reference or reserve currency, for example. So that can emerge, and people should work on it. But it hasn't, and it hasn't for reasons of self-interest. I think that this question about what's happened in China is even more interesting the way you posed it, Bish, because China has changed since 1978 a lot. And the rule of law and all of these points that Suzanne was making, what you need for innovation, those things did not exist, as far as I understand, during the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. Now, you're quite right that many people, including the Clinton administration officials, who were very important in the 1990s on these issues, thought that trade would lead to either democracy. I'm not sure they thought democracy in China was that important, but they thought it would lead to better relations with China and more friendly relations. And I think this goes back to Barry Posner's. I think what Barry was pointing out was that the rivalry between great powers or important powers before 1914 was between countries that had substantially capitalist economic systems. And there was a thought then that trade and mutual investment would either prevent war or lower the probability of war, and that's not what happened. So yes, there are reasons to be concerned, and war at this level would be absolutely awful and should be avoided. So China has learned important lessons and figured out actually not just the manufacturing side, the innovation side also. Whether they can remain as they are now while also pushing the frontier on science remains to be seen. It's very hard to be top-level innovative without a lot of political freedom alongside it. That's been many countries' experience, but who knows? With China may be different.
Let's see. Unfortunately, I know that people have lined up for questions, but we've run out of time for the session. I would just encourage you to reach out to the individual panelists and speak. But just in the interest of time and respecting the time, I just want to say how incredible these two presentations were. That was great. I learned a lot. I'm sure we could learn more. So please join me in thanking them. And I would also like to thank the Center for International Studies for hosting. It's really important that we have a center like CIS that is convening these kinds of conversations like the one that's going to happen in a few weeks as well. These are critical issues, not just out there, but it's actually for our community, as we heard. And the more that we can come together, debate different perspectives, learn from one another, and think about what we could do differently is going to be good for us, but I think good for the world. So thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you very much for CIS for convening us. And again, thank you for our two great speakers this evening. Good night.